What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another podcast episode here on Met Central. This is Met Central Podcast episode 98, where we have plenty of things to discuss today on today's podcast episode as the offseason has officially started with the World Series now being officially over. Obviously, we all saw it. Devastating loss for the Toronto Blue Jays as they lose the World Series. And like I said, just devastating fashion to the LA Dodgers as the Dodgers now pick up their ninth World Series title and they win back-to-back World Series. As we remember last year, they defeat the New York Yankees in 5 games to take their eighth World Series. And then this past World Series, obviously, they take down the Blue Jays in 7 hard-fought games. And like I said, they are your back-to-back world champions. But that's all over now. Obviously, the 2025 season, it's a full wrap now. You could put a bow on it. It's all over. Now it's full steam ahead to 2025. And obviously, the Mets have been looking forward more recently to this offseason because they got what's it called, eliminated from the playoffs, or not even they got eliminated from the playoffs, but because they got knocked out in the regular season before even the playoffs started. So yeah, obviously, looks like I said, we have a lot of things to discuss in this podcast episode. Obviously, the main topics on this one being Edwin Diaz opting out, some more coaching updates, and then of course I'm going to give you guys my offseason plan in terms of who I would sign, who I would trade away, who I would also trade for, and also I'll kind of just show you guys my projected 26-man roster, how I would at least look to line up this team, and also maybe give you guys some defensive alignments because I did also cook up some graphics for you guys as well, to keep the show a little more entertaining and a little bit more colorful and just like I said, more engaging as well. So, but yeah, guys. Anyway, let's get into this podcast episode. Oh, and also before I get into that, as always, make sure you guys leave a like and subscribe on the channel. We always appreciate you guys' support here on Met Central, and we want to keep feeding you guys content throughout the off season. Like I said, anytime, because especially like I anticipate we're gonna have a busy offseason. There's gonna be trades. There's gonna be massive signings. There might be big trades the Mets might bring in terms of pitchers like Tarek Skubal. Maybe they trade away a couple guys as well as salary dumps as well. So, but what's it called? Yeah, it's gonna be a long and good episode, and yeah, and obviously, like I said, it's also episode 98. We're also a couple more episodes away from episode 100. So like I said, I constantly just want to keep, thanking you guys for all your support because, if you guys weren't here, we'd also wouldn't be doing this as well. Because like, as I always say, the main reason we do this stuff, the main reason why we keep uploading content on here in terms of live streams and also, uploads in terms of just regular videos, because we want to entertain you guys. And like I said, without you guys showing us support, obviously we would not be able to do that per se. But yeah, anyway, let's finally, start to jump into the official podcast episode. And, obviously, the first place I think we should start off, and because it was not really, it was major news, it was expected news, but this certain player is going to play a major piece in terms of how the Mets shape their offseason. And of course, that guy being Edwin Diaz. And of course, we got the news a couple days ago, or at least probably a week ago, as per se. But Edwin Diaz, as it was, pretty much predicted by everybody, he opted out of his contract. And if you guys recall, back after the 2022 season, Edwin Diaz hit the free agent market and he signed a 5-year, $102 million contract, just over around $20 million a year. And of course, after his first 3 seasons, he had an opt out. And like I said, a couple days ago, we found out that Diaz would opt out of that contract. And now he's going to officially hit the free agent market. And if you also look at some of the projections in terms of what his contract is going to look like in this upcoming offseason, it is projected that Diaz is going to sign a 4-year deal around $82 million, which again, his AAV would look around $20 million or just over $20 million, similarly to what his first contract looked like as well. Um, and also the big difference between this time where Edwin Diaz hits the free agency market and in terms of last time in 2022, and this was something that I didn't even realize until I was watching a couple videos like James and Marco from Met Stuff. Make sure you guys check out their channels and stuff because they do a great job, as well as Carson, Andrew, and Frank over at Mets Weekly. They also do a great job. But the one thing that I didn't realize is Edwin Diaz during the 2022 offseason, he actually signed so quickly and early in free agency that the Mets did not even have the chance to offer him the qualifying offer. And this time around, and I believe the Mets already did, but the Mets are going to offer Edwin Diaz the qualifying offer this time. Now, this means, and I'm sure you guys know because you guys are baseball fans. If you guys weren't, you obviously wouldn't be watching the stream right now. But with the qualifying offer, that means that, and I believe the qualifying offer right now is around $21-22 million a year. And let's just say, for example, if Edwin Diaz wouldn't re-sign with the Mets and he signed with another team, like let's give for example, and this would be the worst case scenario, he would sign with the LA Dodgers, right? The Mets would get a draft pick because they offered Edwin Diaz a qualifying offer. And like I said, they would get an extra draft pick, a compensation pick, because he did not resign with them. But this is kind of a big thing because, and like I said, I didn't even realize that Diaz didn't, or the Mets didn't offer the qualifying offer the first time. But this is good news for the Mets that now they have the chance to offer him the qualifying offer. And this is a big difference between Diaz's situation and in terms of Pete's contract situation. Because if you guys remember, the Mets offered Pete Alonso the qualifying offer last year. And obviously the Mets re-signed him. But because that happened last year, the Mets could no longer give Pete the qualifying offer for this upcoming free agency, which would mean that more teams would be in on him and his market would be a lot bigger because you don't have to give up that draft pick along with the huge salary compensation that you're going to sign a guy like Pete Alonso to. And this is a good thing for the Mets, right? Because in my opinion, and I'm sure you guys recall back to a couple podcast episodes, and I'm sure it was a couple episodes even before the season even ended to begin with. But I said going to this offseason, I did not think personally that Edwin Diaz would be brought back just because I thought personally that he would ask for too many years, and I thought the money would just be a little too greater than what David Stearns would be comfortable offering him. However, given how the season ended, and given we've had now a couple weeks to reflect and kind of look at what the free agency market is going to look like in this upcoming offseason, my whole opinion and my whole perspective is flipped. I think, not even I think, I know the Mets cannot afford to lose Edwin Diaz. And the fact that, like I said, the Mets had the ability to offer him the qualifying offer this time, it helps their chances of re-signing him significantly. Because, like I said, now, if another team wants to sign Edwin Diaz in term or on top of offering him more money and more years, they would also have to give the Mets an extra draft pick. So, like I said, just because of now that Diaz has the qualifying offer, it's going to dramatically shrink his market. And really, in my opinion, I only believe that there will be two teams in on Edwin Diaz. Obviously, there could be more, and I don't have any sources on that. It just depends on whether if teams are comfortable giving a 31-year-old closer or a 32-year-old closer, 4 years, 5 years on top of giving up, a draft pick. So, but in my opinion, like I said, I believe that there are only two teams that are the front runners for Edwin Diaz, that being the New York Mets and that being the LA Dodgers, which kind of does scare me because we all know that the LA Dodgers have infinite money. They can just pull money randomly out their ass, and they are always active in free agency. They're always active in free agency, and they're always looking to upgrade on their team. We saw last year or last offseason where they come off the World Series win, and then their first signing of the year being a guy in Blake Snell who was a two-time Cy Young winner. So we all know that the Dodgers are looking to always improve, spend money, and get better. And that is what I want the Mets to do. Like I said, I have dramatically changed my opinion to where at first I wasn't fully comfortable bringing back Edwin Diaz on this contract. But like I said, because of how things have changed and, kind of looking at the free agency market in terms of relievers, I fully think now you can't lose Edwin Diaz. You can't, especially when you look at how the Mets projected bullpen for next year currently lines up. Because if you go on Fangraphs, right, the Mets projected roster, or at least their projected bullpen looks like AJ Minter, which fine, cool. And like I said, AJ Minter was a huge addition to the bullpen last year, and it sucked so much that he ended up going down during the year with where he ended up tearing his lat. So that was a big miss. Obviously, Brooks Raley is going to come back. The Mets they're already activated his team option. You have Adbert Alzolay, who spent the whole year last year through injury. You also have Oscar Brazoban. You have Austin Warren. You have Jose Castillo, who the Mets claimed off waivers. You have Richard Lovelady, who the Mets brought back on a major league deal. And you have Brandon Waddell, who also came back on a major league deal. And obviously, when you look at other guys, Reed Garrett, he's going to miss the whole year through Tommy John surgery. Max Kranick also. I know he exactly didn't have Tommy John surgery, but he had a surgery similar to Tommy John surgery. So we will see, how long. Maybe he does come back through the end of next year. Obviously, like I said, we'll see how that plays out. You have Denzel Nunez, who again, like Reed Garrett, got Tommy John surgery. He's going to miss the whole season. And then you have Danny Young as well, who's going to miss majority of this year because, like I said, he got Tommy John surgery at the beginning of last year. I believe it was at the end of April / beginning of May. So if he does come back, it's going to be towards towards the end of the season, and he's going to spend most of the season, either recovering and then doing, rehab starts down or, rehab bullpen outings out of the in the minor leagues. So it is, like I said, it is desperate for Edwin Diaz to re-sign with the Mets. And like I said, I think, and also, I don't think there's really, and I want to be careful when I say this, I don't know if there's really a limit to signing Edwin Diaz. Listen, obviously, I'm not going to offer him 6-7 years. Could I see a team like the Dodgers offer Edwin Diaz a 5-year deal to just, get that deal over the line? 100%. I absolutely could. I also think, though, there is a chance, though, that Edwin Diaz could, because he enjoyed his time so much here in New York, and I know it started off a little rocky in 2019, and then, 2020, 2021, there were decent years, and then, he really picked it up 2022, had that incredible year where he won reliever of the year. Obviously, 2023, unfortunate with the injury, he missed that entire year. 24, had a nice bit of a bounce-back year, had his struggles here and there, but most of the time he was decent. And then obviously 2025 last year, and even, you guys see here, with the stats here from Anthony DiComo. Last year, Edwin Diaz in 62 appearances gave you a 1.63 ERA with 28 saves. And also the other good thing with Edwin Diaz is, and this is something that you don't get a lot with other relievers, this is a guy that is willing to go out there and give multi innings, because how many times did we see Edwin Diaz, or at least we saw Diaz want to go out there for multiple innings and give this team a 6-out save. Obviously, I wish we would have been able to give him the opportunity to give you 6-out save in that last National Series at Citi Field, but unfortunately, Carlos Mendoza decided to be the smarter man and decided to only pull Edwin Diaz after he only threw 9, 10, 11 pitches and got 3 outs. So. But that is also the other big thing with Edwin Diaz, which, again, like, in my opinion, he's too valuable to lose. And especially right now, when you look at the Mets bullpen depth, it's not great. And obviously there are a couple of other guys at which the Mets could sign in free agency to also, bolster their depth in the bullpen. And could they also make trades? Absolutely. And obviously, I'm going to get to that, as we get through later the episode, and I, give you guys, my offseason plan for this year. But I mean, even let's just say, for example, if the Mets and Edwin Diaz can't come together for a contract, and he ends up doesn't coming back, there is alternative options. But let's be honest, they're not great alternative options. Obviously, Robert Suarez is in there, who spent last year with the San Diego Padres. He's a decent reliever, but again, do you want to offer him 4 or 5 years? And I believe he's either a year or 2 years older than Edwin Diaz. So again, if you're kind of hesitant to give Edwin Diaz a 4-year contract, well then, why would you necessarily give Robert Suarez a kind of deal? And he's going to be asking for a lot of money as well. Obviously, you have Devin Williams, who, David Stearns is very familiar with. Obviously, obviously he was the president of baseball operations there in Milwaukee. And obviously Devin Williams, after Josh Hader was traded away to San Diego at the 2022 trade deadline, he assumed the closing role in Milwaukee. Had great success there. Got traded to the Yankees last year and struggled for large parts of the year. Could the Mets maybe sign him on, like a buy low, or like a buy low and high return type of deal? 100%. I could absolutely see him doing that. Am I a complete fan of that? No, but it could be an option. And obviously Kenley Jansen, Kenley Jansen was a great closer back in his day, but the guy, in my opinion, he's old, he's washed. I would, fully just stay away from that. And then Emilio Pagan, again, decent closer, decent reliever. But again, do I really want to, give like a decent amount of money to Emilio Pagan when at best he's kind of just decent? No, not really. So like I said, and this was my last point here on the graphic, Diaz is the no doubt clear choice for the Mets, and they 100% need to bring him back, because even like we saw in the playoffs this year, right? When you look at the bullpens for some of the teams that especially got to the Final Four or for the World Series per se, it's like you look at their bullpen and you look at the closing options, they weren't great. I mean, you even look at the two teams that made it to the World Series this year in the LA Dodgers and the Toronto Blue Jays. You know, the Toronto Blue Jays, they had a decent bullpen, but at the end of the day, their closer was Jeff Hoffman, who, and again, Jeff Hoffman's a decent reliever, but he's necessarily not that, top end, top of the line closer like Edwin Diaz is. And then when you look at the Dodgers, on the other hand, per se, their bullpen was so bad this year during the regular season and during the playoffs, specifically like a guy like Tanner Scott, who they gave big money to be their closer. He was so bad, and like I said, their bullpen as a whole was so bad that the Dodgers had to rely on their starters to go out there and give you extra long length in starts. And then even like you saw guys like Yoshinobu Yamamoto come out of the bullpen in some closeout games just to get those final couple outs. And then they also had to turn to Roki Sasaki as well, and he kind of converted from a starter to a closer to finish out that season, to finish out the World Series. So I believe that it's very important to bring back Edwin Diaz. And listen, I get that people also say that because you guys obviously know as baseball fans, the old cliche is that you don't want to give big time money to relievers per se, because we know that relievers are fickle. They could be great one year and then they could be total asset next year. I mean, prime example, look at a guy like Aaron Loop. The Mets signed him for cheap in 2021, had just this great standout year, ended up going to free agency. I believe the Angels signed him to like a 3-4 multi-year deal at at decent money, and then he ended up just going back to the old time era loop where we saw inconsistent results and him not being great. So you have to be careful with relievers, but I believe, like I said, with Edwin Diaz, and this is similar to guys like him, Josh Hader, and at Emmanuel Clase as well before he got into this whole mess, which Emmanuel Clase just dumped to begin with. I'm not going to get too much into this, but yeah, with a guy like Edwin Diaz, who that every time he goes out there, he's going to be reliable. He's going to give you outs. Listen, sometimes will Edwin Diaz give you a heart attack? Absolutely. Prime example was, the towards the end of the year in September, that Cincinnati Reds outing where he ended up loading up the bases, no outs, and then he gets out of it 1, 2, 3. So can Edwin Diaz give you the occasional scare? Yes, but at the end of the day, that's every reliever. And like I said, Edwin Diaz, for me, he's so consistent. He's so good. He's so dominant. His strikeout stuff is so good. Yes, is he a little bit vulnerable to the stolen base? Absolutely. But, he doesn't walk guys a ton, strikes out a ton of guys. And it's similar to almost like if you compare it to Mariano Rivera. And listen, Edwin Diaz is not Mariano Rivera. I don't want to, put that, I don't want to put that type of thing out because I know Yankee fans will get mad in the first place. Also, let's respect Mariano Rivera, the best closer in all baseball. But the reason why the Yankees always brought him back is because the guy was just so reliable. And it's the same thing with Edwin Diaz. So like I said, for me, I completely flip-flop my situation, because like I said, at first, before we even got to the offseason, I was like, I'm not really comfortable with bringing back Edwin Diaz on big-term money. And I also just thought, from David Stern's perspective, I didn't think he was going to offer him that type of contract as well. Like I said, like the projection, 4 years at $82 million. But because of how the season ended up playing out, and because currently when you look at the other options on the free agency market and you look at the current state of what the Mets bullpen is looking like, I just sit here to myself and I'm like, yeah, there is no doubt. You 100% have to bring back Edwin Diaz, like without a doubt. But anyway, guys, before we move on to the next topic, I'm just going to go through you guys' comments and see what you guys are saying. Pantrice, welcome to the show. Pretty confident we re-signed Diaz. Stearns has said one of his biggest regrets was not keeping Hader with the Brewers. Doubt he makes that same mistake. 100%. And even and I know it's kind of different because he traded Hader, so at least you got back some assets for him. But even when you look at the trade that the Brewers received back for Josh Hader, the Padres did not give up a lot. So, and like I said, and this point's different because you would lose Edwin Diaz for nothing, and he could potentially go to one of your biggest rivals and one of your biggest competitors in the LA Dodgers. So I believe that the Mets and David Stearns cannot allow Diaz to walk from the Mets to the Dodgers. You 100% cannot let that happen. And like you said, Pantrice, I fully believe that Edwin Diaz will be back. And it's like I said, I believe Diaz will be back, and then obviously we'll get to my offseason plan. And I believe that one other big time guy that's also up for a contract this year, I don't believe he's going to be back either. So, like I said, and for me, I would rather keep Edwin Diaz over that so-called first baseman. And listen, we will obviously get to that. Ray, what is going on? If Stearns is all about run prevention, then someone needs to teach Diaz how to hold runners on base. 100%. And listen, that's one of his biggest flaws. But also, if you're going to improve the defense behind Edwin Diaz, and you also keep the catching tandem of Francisco Alvarez and Luis Torrens behind the plate, and we all know how good that they were at throwing out runners when they attempted to steal, then obviously it's not that much of a problem because I mean, if you guys recall back to like 2022, 2021, when the Mets catchers were, it was a tandem of James McCann, Tomas Nido, Omar Narvaez. Those guys could not steal, could not throw out anybody whatsoever. So, but the fact that the Mets have two reliable guys, like I said, behind the plate in terms of Francisco Alvarez, Luis Torrens, in terms of that you trust their arm to throw out, you trust them to throw out runs at second base. It's not so much of a problem than it was before last time. Obviously, I still don't like the fact that Diaz is very susceptible to other guys stealing bases off him, but it is what it is. I would give up that trade off. I would rather have Diaz's strikeout stuff and be left with the fact that he's not great at leaving on runners per se. Listen, sometimes you have to give something for something, right? And like I said, it is what it is. But like I said, if you're going to have two catchers behind the plate that have fantastic arms and are able to what's called throw runners out at second base consistently, like we saw with Alvarez and Torrens last year, then like I said, it's not so much of a problem. You had a thought after doing a certain thing with an animal. No comment on that one. No comment on that one. If you know, you know. Glad Minter is back. 100% absolutely right. Minter was such a huge addition to this bullpen last year, and it was such a huge blow to this team when he ended up going down because, like I said, there were large points of last year, and this was something that we stated throughout multiple episodes was, and if you guys recall, there were long periods of time where the Mets went out or they were pitching games without a reliable lefty in that bullpen, obviously, and then especially after Danny Young went down. I mean, the Mets were running through guys like Hennessy Cabrera, Luis Castillo, who they brought back. There wasn't a lot of great, and then obviously they picked up Richard Lovelady later in the season. Then they ended up having to trade for Gregory Soto, who was an absolute disaster at the trade deadline. So the fact that Minter's going to be back next year and hopefully he's going to be healthy and hopefully, he doesn't have any more injury concerns next year, that's going to be, a huge staple of that bullpen. Drew Hornet, what is going on as well? Drew Smith, yeah. Get Drew Smith out of here. And thankfully he's gone because I don't have to worry about I don't have to worry about watching him ever again. Edwin Diaz never blew a Game 7 in the World Series, though. Don't compare the GOAT to some random Yankee pitcher, Mariano Rivera, whatever that guy's name is. Yeah, it is what it is. Ryan Estilo, what's going on? Hornet again. What's Edwin's motivation? Is it dollars or a World Series? That will make his decision. I think, listen, obviously Diaz wants to get paid. That's 100%. But I also do believe he wants to win. And I believe, listen, this is not like with the Wilpon Mets where even if you do get paid like what we saw with David Wright, where you didn't have a shot to win a World Series, I fully believe to where, and like I said, Diaz does want to get paid, but I believe there is a world where maybe Diaz does take a little bit of a discount to come back and stay with the Mets because again, listen, last year was an out-and-out disaster, right? But going to next year, the plan is to compete and to win a World Series next year. So I believe that if Edwin Diaz does come back, he takes maybe a little bit of a discount. The team is going to be in a position where they're going to try to win and to win a World Series and be competitive. So listen, does maybe Diaz rather go from the Mets to the Dodgers and have a better chance to win and get paid more money? 100%. But like you said, that's like you said, Hornet. What's his motivation going to be? And ultimately, it's his decision. I believe though he's going to want to come back, and I believe that the Mets are going to want to bring it back as well. So I believe there's what's it called? There is motivation on both sides to get a deal done. And like I said, I do believe in the long run that it's going to happen. Jose Castillo, I wish it was Luis Castillo, 100%. Ray, again, you want dollars and trophy. You want dollars and trophies at the same time. 100%, absolutely. You want to get paid fairly. And listen, like I said, with players, with modern day athletes, because I know we always say, so much money is now thrown around in Major League Baseball and other professional sports. But listen, at the end of the day, these are professional athletes. They want to get paid, and I fully respect their decision to want to get paid. But listen, like I said, I am not too concerned because if the Mets are willing to shell out the money and shell out the years for Edwin Diaz, he's going to be back. I don't have any worry about that per se. Two Cats, Dodgers got really lucky this year. Of course, the skill was there, but I thought Toronto, for the most part, outplayed them that whole series. The unclutchness killed them in the end, reminding me of the Mets. 100%. I mean, when you look back to Game 6, right? The Dodgers, I believe they were up 2-0 or was up 3-1, and then the Blue Jays ended up having second and third, no outs, and then 3 pitches later, the what's it called? The Dodgers end up winning that game because Ernie Clement decides to swing first pitch, he pops out, and then that just crazy double play at the end to end that game. At that point, I'm like looking at Game 7. I'm like, yeah, when you blow an opportunity like that to tie that game and to extend the game, I'm like, there is no shot that the Blue Jays are going to win Game 7 and win the World Series. But then, you look at Game 7, right? They get up to that crazy 3-0 lead, courtesy of a Bo Bichette home run, and then obviously the Dodgers just end up tying the game because they have fucking devil magic. I mean, freaking Rojas just ends up tying the game, and then you look again, bases loaded, 1 out. All you need is a sacrifice fly to to win that game and to win the World Series, and the Blue Jays are unable to do it. It reminded me a lot about the Mets in that whole series because the Blue Jays in the final 2 games, they just could not get the big hit outside of that Bo Bichette home run in Game 7. Great world, yeah, and obviously the Two Cats, I fully agree with you. That was a great World Series. Ton of action. Obviously, you had the 18-inning game in Game 3, but yeah, I mean, anytime you get a 7-game series in a final of any sport, it's bound to go down as a very good series. If the Mets don't play down the bottom feeders, we all know how far they can go. They like playing against top teams more for some reason. 100%, and that was a huge Achilles heel for them this year because I mean, again, you look at some of the series that finished out the year. I mean, obviously, the final 6 games against the Nationals, the Mets ended up losing 4, and then I believe the final 7 games against the Marlins to finish out that year, the Mets ended up going 2-5. So right there, if you beat lesser competition, you're automatically in the playoffs right there. But that's something, and even I've said this plenty of times. That's something that hurt last year's team, and then that even hurts something that even hurt the 2024 team as well. Even though that team went a lot farther. Evan, it also seems like Díaz is the priority and not Pete, so they better get it done 100%. Future Met Bo Bichette, maybe. He's not involved in my offseason plans per se. Obviously, I have another guy that the Mets could potentially target to go up the middle. But listen, if the Mets sign Bo Bichette, I'm not necessarily going to complain. And yes, Two Cats, that's another great point as well. Hurt the 2022 team in the division. Lapped the 2019 World Series, in my opinion. Yeah, 100%. 100%. I mean, that was a great World Series as well. But yeah, the 2025 World Series will go down as one of the all-time World Series as well. But guys, anyway, let's move on to the next topic because we do have some more stuff to talk about, and that obviously being the coaching staff. Because what was it, last week or about a week and a half ago, we got some news in which Mets fans were not too thrilled about. And that being that Jeremy Hefner and Antoine Richardson, obviously Jeremy Hefner being let go a couple weeks ago, and obviously Antoine Richardson left the organization because they could not come to terms on the contract. But we ended up learning that those 2 guys would end up going down to Georgia and join the Atlanta Braves coaching staff, which, like I said, Mets fans were not too happy about that. And listen, here's my opinion on this. And this is not so much of a Jeremy Hefner point. This is more of an Antoine Richardson point. Does it suck to lose him to the Braves? 100%. Am I sitting here freaking out and, lashing out at David Stearns and lashing out at Steve Cohen? No. Because listen, at the end of the day, like I said, does it suck to lose Antoine Richardson? Yes. Was he a valuable part of this Mets coaching staff? Pretty much was he the only good part of this Mets coaching staff last year? 100%. But at the end of the day, we have to remember that he's a first base coach. And listen, like I said, I get that he made tons of improvements to the base running, and he made Juan Soto a 38 stolen base guy. But like I said, at the end of the day, the Mets had to also do their due diligence as well as filling out some of their some other parts of the coaching staff as well. Like I said, they had to get a new pitching coach, which they didn't hire yet completely, but it looks like that it's on course to being Justin Wood and Justin Wood, and we'll get more to that. Obviously, like I said, they still have to hire a first base coach. They recently just hired a third base coach. They brought in Jeff Albert to be the hitting coordinator at the major league level. They brought in Snicker to be the hitting coach under Jeff Albert. And like I said, because even when you look at some of the points I wrote out here, obviously, like I said, Jeremy Hefner moves closer to his family in Atlanta. The Mets tried very hard to come to an agreement on a contract with Richardson. That was from Andy Martino. However, there was a difference in value, and that was from Mike Puma. And obviously, and I think the main value that Richardson was kind of looking for, I think one was the ability to step up in the coaching staff in terms of maybe going from a first base coach to being a bench coach. But obviously, the Mets already locked up their bench coach in Kai Correa, so obviously that wasn't not an option for Antoine Richardson. And then also because after the whole thing came out, we also learned that Richardson had originally circled back to the Mets. However, the Mets could not offer the same contract they originally did because they already had offered pension plans to other coaches that they hired, and that came from Mike Puma. And like I said, it was important that the Mets had filled out other parts of the coaching staff because, like I said, the hitting department, it was very important to upgrade on that because obviously, anytime you upgrade from Eric Chavez to Jeremy Barnes, it's going to be a dramatic upgrade. And like I said, just going based off the resumes of guys like Snitker and Jeff Albert, that looks like, dramatic, improvements to the hitting department there. Obviously, like I said, they still have to make an official announcement on Jeff Willard, or sorry, Justin Willard, because that looks like he's going to be the Mets main pitching coach. And like I said, they still have to find a replacement for Antoine Richardson, and the fact that they also ended up hiring a third base coach as well. So, like I said, does it suck that the Mets end up losing both Jeremy Hefner and Antoine Richardson to the Braves because they are a division rival? 100%. But am I sitting here freaking out like some other Met fans were and saying, this is, like the worst thing ever? How could this happen? No. Like I said, it sucks because Richardson was a very valuable piece of this coaching staff, but I don't think it's something that we should be losing sleep over. And like I said, this is not to throw, shade or a shot at Antoine Richardson, but it's like when the Mets brought in Antoine Richardson in 2024, did we know who Antoine Richardson was? No, we didn't. And even this was a point that I think both Carson and Andrew throughout their on their last Mets Weekly podcast, which if you guys didn't check out, make sure you guys check it out as well because like I said, they do a great job with it. They do a great job on their channel. But like I said, just because Antoine Richardson is not here with the Mets anymore, it doesn't mean that the Mets can't use his philosophies and his coaching style, just because he's gone. Like that is not illegal. You could still use his base running philosophies and his, base running tips, even though he's not here. So like I said, does it suck? Yes, but at the end of the day, it is what it is. And then obviously we actually go to the second part of this graphic where we have the arrivals and unconfirmed hires. Obviously, the unconfirmed hire being Justin Willard. And like I said here, Justin Willard is emerging as the front runner to become the Mets' new pitching coach. That was from Will Salmon of The Athletic. Willard had been hired by the Red Sox in November of 2024 and had previously worked as a coach and a coordinator with the Minnesota Twins. And this was a quote from Justin Willard, which I really liked. Willard had stated that, he has a really simple approach when it comes to pitching and his philosophy. Throw nasty stuff in the zone. You can have nasty stuff, but it's not going to be maximized if you're not throwing it in the zone. And that was from Brown, who I believe I have his article pulled up here as well. But that is a quote that I really like per se. And the reason why I like this because when you look at the Mets pitching staffs or when you look at their pitching staff the last couple of years, the biggest issue that has hurt this Mets team, because even though some of the pitchers that they brought in over the past couple of years, they've had nasty stuff and they've had really good pitches. But like I said, the main problem with the staff was they walked a ton of guys. And that's why you start to see a lot of high pitch counts, a lot of, in terms of longer innings, maybe you would have those innings where teams would start to attack and then you would have those big crooked multi-run innings. Well, like I said, if you're not throwing a lot of pitches and you're not walking guys and you're throwing efficient strikes and you're getting guys out fairly quickly, that is going to severely improve, not only your bullpen depth, but also things like your bullpen health and also, your bullpen stamina as well going through the rest of the season. Because, if you're not sitting here, earlier in the season and you're, constantly having these long innings, obviously you're going to have more of a fresher bullpen and more of, saved and improved arms going down to the latter half of the year. And even we saw this with other Mets pitchers per se, like even like with Clay Holmes this year. Like, listen, we all know that Clay Holmes has pretty good stuff, right? He has a decent sinker, has a very good sweeper, has a very good kick change, and when those pitches are on, he gets a lot of swings and misses on those pitches. But then we also know when those pitches aren't on per se, Clay Holmes is nibbling around the zone and he's throwing a lot of balls and he's walking guys. And even, we can see this sometimes with, guys like Edwin Díaz and even, kind of heard Sean Manaea this year as well and other guys as well. So I believe that, and if, if Justin Willard comes in and he is able to improve, or at least he's able to implement his philosophy on this Mets, pitching staff, both on the starting wise and then both on the bullpen wise. I believe that this bullpen and this pitching staff per se is going to take another step forward because even when you look at the team ERA this year, and I have it pulled up, the Red Sox this year had the fifth best pitching ERA at 3.72. Meanwhile, the Mets were all the way down in 18th with a 4.04 ERA. And listen, I know that injuries had to do, or at least played a part in why the ERA ended up taking such a massive hit, especially through the second half of the year. But let's look at also the main fact that this year the Mets pitching staff did not do a great job with eliminating walks, and even then, when you look at the base on balls per nine, the Mets were the seventh worst team this year at a 3.49 at 3.49 walks per nine. So that is something that they need to majorly improve on. And hopefully with Justin Willard, because even we saw, he's made improvements with some Red Sox pitchers. Obviously, Aroldis Chapman, since signing with the Red Sox, he ended up taking, just not necessarily a next step, but he kind of regalvanized and was able to refine his form, in which we saw him, in his past Yankee years, or even, in 2016 when he was straight over to the Chicago Cubs. And, even, he made improvements and tinkered with Garrett Crochet. He ended up teaching Garrett Crochet a sinker, and that expanded his arsenal, ended up making him a lot more better of a pitcher and a lot more dominant of a pitcher. So if Justin Willard can come in here and he can, like I said, fully implement his pitching philosophy on this Mets pitching staff, I fully believe you see this Mets pitching staff being able to take that next step forward and being that much better. Because, like I said, we all saw how much better and how much improved that the Mets pitching looked in the first half of the year. And still, that was even with a ton of walks and having kind of these long drawn out innings. Obviously, like I said, the injuries played a major part in why the pitching looked not great throughout the second half. But like I said, if you bring in Justin Willard and he brings in this philosophy in terms of where you're throwing more nasty stuff in the zone and you're limiting the walks, like I said, that's going to improve your bullpen and your whole pitching staff for the latter half in the second part of the year. Because like I said, you're not going to throw as many pitches. There won't be as much fatigue, and you'll be able to better preserve your bullpen arms and your starter arms as well. So like I said, hopefully this deal fully gets completed, and I would fully 100% welcome Justin Willard to the Mets organization if he does come here as the Jeremy Hefner replacement. And then also there was other news with the Mets coaching staff as they were able to hire a new third base coach as well. They obviously brought in Tim Leippier. And like I said, the Mets plan to hire Tim Leippier as the third base coach, replacing Mike Sarba, which again, Mike Sarba had to go because he had a terrible year as third base coach. And then Leippier had been the third base coach for the Padres the past 2 years. And before that, he had been the Blue Jays first base coach from 2014 to 2018. But yeah, I mean, that pretty much kind of sums up the Mets coaching staffs. The move so far, obviously, like I said, hopefully they get this Justin Willard deal fully wrapped up and he's, hired as the pitching coach for this team. And then, like I said, Tim Leippier was brought in as the third base coach. And I mean, pretty much after that, all the Mets have to do is find a replacement for Antoine Richardson at first base coach. And then pretty much their whole coaching staff is confirmed. Because like I said, they hired Kai Correa as their bench coach. You have Jeff Albert as the Major League hitting coordinator, followed by Troy Snitker as the hitting coach. So pretty much, like I said, after that, you hire a first base coach as to replace Antoine Richardson, and then pretty much, the coaching staff is fully wrapped up. So yeah, so far, listen, on paper, I like the coaching staff; it looks good. But obviously, like I said, just going based off resumes and going based off opinions, it does say something, but it doesn't tell the whole story at the end of the day. At the end of the day, like I said, we have to see results at the end of the day. And if it translates well to the field and it translates well to the Mets being a better coach team, then the Mets are going to be a better team next year. Because like I said, one of the main reasons why I fully believe the Mets did not make the playoffs this year, and this was something that me and Evan have stated plenty of times on this podcast throughout the year, the Mets were one of the worst coach teams in the major leagues, in my opinion, this year. So yeah, hopefully these guys come in and they're fully able to implement their philosophies on this team. And then, like I said, we see this team take that next step forward. But guys, before I move on to my offseason plans, I'm just going to go through your guys' comments as well, see what you guys have to say. Ray, again, hey, I'm just happy Chavez is gone. 100%. And this is even something that I even talked about with Turbo and Evan on the last podcast that we did, which if you guys didn't check that out, make sure you guys do check that out because that was a very funny and a very entertaining episode as well. But listen, if I had to make the decision, if I was given the ultimatum where I'm like, okay, Eric Chavez is going to get fired this year, but Antoine Richardson would have to go as well, I'd fully take that trade off 100%. And I'm sure you guys in the comments would as well because what's it called? In my opinion, Eric Chavez was much more of a detriment to this team offensively than Antoine Richardson was a positive to this team being in terms of being a better, base running team and being a better base stealing team. So like I said, does it suck to lose a guy like Antoine Richardson to the Braves? 100%. But at the end of the day, Eric Chavez is gone, so I'm going to fully enjoy that, and I'm going to fully enjoy, guys like Jeff Albert and Troy Snicker leading the Mets offensive and leading the Mets hitting program. So I will take that. I would take that 100% every single day of the week. Pantries, it sucks that all of our old coaches, players always go to our rivals, never to the AL or even West Coast. Nope, always stay in the LE or stay in the NL East. I mean, Desi Druskull ended up going to the Yankees. So, and I know that's a quote unquote rival for ours with them being a crosstown rival, but I would rather him go back to the Yankees than let's say him going to an NL East rival like the Phillies or the Braves or even the Marlins and the Nationals, right? So, or even the Dodgers per se, even though Mark Pryor is their pitching coach. But like I said, I would rather him at least go to the Yankees than, like I said, and like you said, Pantry going to an NL East division rival. Ray, let Hefner go to Atlanta and scrub up that staff over there. Listen, I like Jeremy Hefner. Did he have flaws? 100%. But at the end of the day, I thought that it was time to divorce and let him go his separate way and let the Mets go his separate way. And like I said, hopefully, if they sign Justin Willard, or what's good, if they hire Justin Willard and that hiring is fully confirmed, then hopefully that what's it called improves the Mets pitching staff dramatically. Hornet, if the Braves hired Eric Chavez, I wouldn't mind so much. Hey, listen, I think the Braves should have hired Eric Chavez to be their manager per se, but hey, listen, I guess we can't have everything in life. But yeah, I mean, listen, if Eric Chavez wants to go over to Atlanta and be their hitting coach, I'm not going to complain. I think because listen, I'm not going to lie. I think Ronald Acuna Jr. would be much better if he was more of a contact hitter than a power hitter, but that's just me per se. Two Cats again. I'm expecting 95 plus wins this season. Like Gary said, it's hard to believe this collection of talent found themselves out of a playoff spot. Completely excusable if they do that. I mean, yeah, listen, like I said, and we repeated this a ton of times this year. The fact that they missed the playoffs this year, it was unexcusable. It was a bad look, and it was embarrassing for the whole franchise. So like I said, I don't know if they're going to win 95 plus games per se. I just want them to at least aim for, if the Mets per se for me can get 90, 91, 92 wins, I will fully take that because again, I don't know if there's going to be a necessarily, runaway division winner this year. Obviously, I think the Braves will be better than they were last year because they were just terrible. I fully believe that the Phillies will at least be somewhat aggressive in free agency, though, so their team will improve. And I believe that the Mets will be aggressive in terms of the trade market and free agency as well because they need to severely improve their team. So I believe that's going to be, again, a tight race for the division. So like I said, I don't believe, either the Braves, the Mets, or the Phillies are going to have, a high 90s win season. But like I said, if the Mets could go around that 90, 91, 92 win mark and, they could either win the division or even take the first wild card spot, I'll fully take that. Just get back into the playoffs. That is the most important thing because this team cannot spend another year out of the playoffs because if they do, then a guy like David Stearns, in which, again, I do trust David Stearns. I fully trust him to correct the mistakes that he made last year in last year's offseason and at the trade deadline. But if the Mets do miss the playoffs again, there needs to be serious conversation about David Stearns being fired. So, but like I said, I trust him to correct his mistakes that he made last year, and I fully believe that this team will be back in the playoffs next year, competing for a playoff spot and competing for a World Series as well. But at the end of the day, they have to make the right moves in the offseason because if they don't, then they're not going to be at that level that they need to be. Ray, again, starters have to go past 6, avoid the dreaded fourth inning meltdowns at 100% because that is something that killed this team, especially in the second half of the year. Because, I mean, even, when we look at the first half of the year, the Mets pitchers, in terms of their starters, they were going deep into the games. David Pearson was giving you 7, even some 8 inning games. Kodai Senga was at least giving you some decent length. Clay Holmes was giving you some length early on the season as well, and then even Tyler McGill before the calendar ended up flipping to May, because we all know March, April, McGill is the best starter in Major League Baseball history. But then after that, like you said, Ray, because the starters were unable to go past six in the second half of the year, that meant that that the bullpen had to get overworked and overtaxed, and that was one of the main reasons why the pitching staff severely fell apart throughout the second half of the year. And that's something that cannot replicate this year, because if it does, then again the Mets are going to have trouble this year putting out there a reliable pitching staff. Two Cats, I think the Phillies take a big step back for some reason, and Braves are back to normal. The Phillies are interesting. They're going to have a lot of decisions to make this year. Obviously, do they bring back Kyle Schwarber? If not, do they maybe target a guy like Kyle Tucker? Obviously, Ranger Suarez is also a free agency. Do they bring him back? Do they let him walk? If they do let him walk, who's their replacement? Do they maybe make a trade like they did last year in the offseason where they brought in Jesus Luzardo from the Miami Marlins? There's going to be a lot of tough decisions that the Phillies are going to have to make. Obviously, does Nick Castellanos end up being traded? Because if they do, and another team does end up taking all that money, which I believe is $20 million, then again, that is money and that is more weaponry that the Phillies could use to improve their team in this upcoming offseason. So, and then with the Braves, I expect that the Braves will be back to a more competitive baseball team. Do I think they're going to be and also with before I move on to the Braves, but then even with the Phillies, Zach Wheeler is going to miss this whole year pretty much. So again, that's a huge miss. That's a huge miss on the Phillies part. But like I said, going back to the Braves, I don't think the Braves will get back to their dominant stage where they were like in 22, 23, and even 2021 where they won the World Series, and even parts of the 2024 season. And now that I say that, watch them win like 96 games next year and then run away with the division. But like I said, the Braves are a talented team. But like I said, I think they'll, like you said, Two Cats, I think they'll be back to their competitive stage. Do I think they'll be, this, again, dominant baseball? I think they could get back to that stage, but I think they'll be more of that competitive, like I said, I think they'll be around the 90, 91, 92 win mark, similar to what, we could see with the Mets and the Phillies as well. That's why I think it's going to be a tight race for the division this year. Two Cats again, Chavez was step one always. And like you said, it might not make a difference at first, but someone had to be held accountable to make a point. 100%. And Two Cats also met very World Series prediction. I don't know. I mean, listen, with the NL, because I think you have to say it, because until they get knocked off, they just had to come out of the National League. I would say it's the Dodgers. In terms of the American League, I'm not sure right now. I am too not sure, but I can at least give you that, from my opinion, sitting here right now, that the Dodgers are at least the early favorite to, win the National League and represent the National League in the World Series. But like I said, with the American League, I'm not sure. The Seattle Mariners could make another run. Obviously it's going to depend on what happens with guys like, because obviously Suarez is a free agent. Josh Naylor is going to be a free agent. I believe even maybe Randy's a free agent, or maybe he's one more year away from entering free agency. So it's going to be interesting to see how the Mariners improve. But, with their dominant pitching staff and their good bullpen, the Mariners could also challenge as well. But like I said, I'm not too sure with the American League yet, but with the National League, I could at least be confident and say that the Dodgers at least are the early favorites to repeat as the National League champions. But we will see. We will see. Obviously, it's still way too early. We're only in November 11th. What guys haven't even really started signing in free agency. So we will see. Like I said, Braves have not won a World Series since their World Series title, which I find hard to believe, and they don't get Braves have not won a World Series since their World Series title, which I find to believe they don't get at least one this year. We'll see. And you think Texas ever gets back to 2023? The Astros even? The Astros I could see get back to, I could see them get back to, being, this very good dominant baseball team. But, they're because like I always say, like runs and dynasties are always meant to, and I'm not saying the Astros were necessarily like a dynasty. Obviously, they were very good. Do I think they necessarily get back to the point at which they were from 2017 to 2023? They could. Do I think it's likely? No, not necessarily. And kind of the same with the Rangers. I don't know if they'll ever get back to, what they were back in 2023. Because like I said, their roster is starting to get a lot more older. Obviously, Marcus Semien is not that same guy. Corey Seager is still great. Obviously, like I said, you still have Jacob deGrom. Um, I'm not sure what the Nathan Eovaldi injury was. I'm not sure if he had to get Tommy John surgery as well, but I mean, if he did and he's out all of next year, that severely hurts their chances. But yeah, I just, and again, like you look at a guy like Adolis Garcia, who was pivotal to their World Series run in 2023. I don't know if the Rangers ever get back to them. I think it's more likely that the Astros get back to what they were prior in their 2017 to 2023 run than what the Rangers were in their World Series run and where they won it in 2023. But again, that's why you have to capitalize when you get to that point, because there was no guarantee you ever get back. I mean, again, look at the Arizona Diamondbacks. They made it to the World Series in 2023, and then the last 2 years they haven't made the playoffs. So the Rangers, the Rangers made it to the World Series that year. They capitalized it. They won their championship, and then you look at the last 2 years. They have not made back to the playoffs. Like I said, that's why you have to capitalize on your opportunities when you make those deep runs. But anyway, guys, that's going to be it for the coaching staff part of the podcast. Now let's start to move on, and this will be the final part of the podcast. This will be my off-season plan and what I would do if I was David Stearns per se. So, firstly, we move on to the pitching moves. Obviously, the number one move we all know, and this was a major talking point of the last podcast episode that we did. Like I said, if you guys didn't check that out, make sure you do. The Mets need an ace pitcher, whether that be Tarek Skubal, whether that be Freddie Peralta, whether that be a guy like Hunter Green, whether it be a guy like Joe Ryan, whether the Mets end up circling back to the Marlins and they end up trading for a guy like Sandy Alcantara or Edward Cabrera. Either way, whichever way you put it, the Mets need an ace level guy. And that's why for my first move of the offseason, the Mets go to Detroit. They trade for Tarek Skubal. They end up sending a package of Jonah Tong, Jet Williams, and David Pearson to Detroit. And even like we said, because we got some news from yesterday, because we actually got a huge news dump last year, or not last year, a day ago, or maybe it was even 2 days ago as well. But the Mets, and I believe this was from Will Salmon of the Athletic as well. He ended up saying that it's more likely that the Mets end up with just one starting rotation addition rather than two, given their crowded group, unless there is a subtraction. And I do fully agree with this point, and that's why I think the Mets end up trading away some pieces in terms of some of their starters, in terms to make moves and to make major upgrades to the starting rotation. So like I said, David Pearson ends up going to Detroit in this deal, so like I said, that ends up opening a spot for Tarek Skubal. My then next move would be Dylan Cease. Now Dylan Cease is an interesting one because for me, I would sign Dylan Cease only if it's a short-term deal. Now, obviously, listen, Dylan Cease is going to look to capitalize on the free agency market. He's going to look for a big-time contract in terms of years and big-time money. But given the fact that he came off a shaky year last year, is a team out there willing to give him that big-time contract? I do not know. But like I said, in my plan, if Dylan Cease is willing to take a 2-year deal, I would fully jump on that. Jump on that opportunity to bring in a guy like Dylan Cease. So like I said, here I would sign Dylan Cease to a 2-year, $50 million deal with an opt-out after the first year, that being a $25 million AAV. And like I said, with the Will Salmon article, obviously if the Mets were to bring in Dylan Cease, they would have to trade one other guys. And that's why over here, I have the Mets trading Kodai Senga for relief depth, and also to the Mets would pay down 1/3 of his contract to trade him away. Which, listen, and circling back to the Kodai Senga part, because this was something, even like I said, that we touched upon briefly in our last podcast episode that we did with Evan and Turbo. The Mets need to trade away Kodai Senga. And listen, I like Kodai Senga. I've been a fan of him since the Mets signed him in the 2023 offseason. For me, you cannot go into next year with that much of a question mark over Kodai Senga. Because like I said, the Mets need to make drastic improvements to the starting rotation. And this was something even David Stearns talked about in his postseason press conference that I did in Citi Field after the season ended, because a reporter asked him about Kodai Senga and asked him, about whether he's reliable and whether he's trustworthy. And David Stearns, just basically bluntly said it's like it would be silly of us to pencil in Kodai Senga for 30 or more starts next year. Which in that case, I think at that point, because he has 3 more years left at $15 million a year, $45 million in total on that contract left, I believe that it's vital to trade Kodai Senga. And listen, if you're going to trade Kodai Senga, and I've always said this, and even this was another update that we got from yesterday from Will Salmon as well. And he basically said that Kodai Senga is attracting trade interest from multiple teams per Will Salmon, but it would be on the reality of him being a buy low, a buy low high potential target. And like I said, this was something that I was going to bring up. If the Mets are going to trade Kodai Senga, they were never going to be in terms of having the higher, they were always going to be on the lower end of the leverage because, like I said, Kodai Senga is coming off 2 straight years in 2024 where he missed basically the whole year through injury, and 2025 he basically missed half this year with injuries. And then when he did come back in the second half of the year, the guy was just a flat out disaster. He had to go down to AAA, and even when he did go down to AAA, he still didn't look great as well. I mean, again, this is a guy that's dealt with little niggles here and there. And listen, like I said, for a starting pitcher and for a guy like Kodai Senga, like I said, I like Kodai Senga, but the Mets need reliability. They need trustworthiness in the starting rotation, and you're not going to get that from Kodai Senga. Which again, and like I said, the Mets are not going to have a ton of leverage in Kodai Senga trade talks. But I believe if you're going to trade Kodai Senga, the biggest thing for me is at least get the other team trading for him to take the majority of his contract. Because if you could if you trade Kodai Senga, right, per se, if you could get the other team to take $30 million of that $45 million deal, and the Mets are only left with having to pay $50 million, and maybe they get, like I said, a depth reliever in return, I would fully be on board with that trade, and I would fully send off Kodai Senga to wherever he would want to go. Because again, you clear valuable money, you clear valuable space in terms of, and more money you have to utilize in terms of how you would maybe look to sign additional starting pitch help, like I said, with Dylan Cease, or maybe even throw it into, other position player moves, which we'll get down, further in this graphic. But after that, going back up after the Dylan Cease one, of course, I would re-sign Edwin Díaz. And like I said, I basically, I basically said everything about Edwin Díaz and why it's important that the Mets bring him back. It was earlier in the stream for you guys. So just in case if you guys missed it, just go back to that first part of the stream. And basically I talked about why it's vital for Edwin Díaz to resign. But like I said, I would resign Edwin Díaz to a 4-year, $82 million deal. That's an AAV just over $20 million a year. And then I would sign Pete Fairbanks as well. And which, again, the Rays just being the Rays, because they never want to pay any of their guys, because the Rays ended up not tendering a deal to Pete Fairbanks, so now he is a free agent. And if I'm the Mets, because again, how we saw just the depth of this bullpen dissipate over the second half of the year. If you have a chance to sign a guy like Pete Fairbanks as bullpen depth, and a chance for him to be that 8th inning setup guy for Edwin Díaz, because this is also something that the Mets have not been able to do since they brought over Edwin Díaz. They have not been able to pair him successfully with the successful 8th inning shutdown guy. Obviously, in 2023, they did sign David Robertson to be that guy, but like I said, Edwin Díaz ended up getting hurt in the World Baseball Classic, and he missed the whole year, so he was not able to. We were not able to fully see that David Robertson and Edwin Díaz tandem in the 8th and 9th inning. And then obviously we saw in 2025 at the trade deadline, we saw them try to replicate that with bringing in Ryan Helsley. But as we all know, Ryan Helsley was just an out-and-out unmitigated disaster. So, like I said, and Edwin Díaz, for me, he does need that, that backup, that little bit of protection. Because like I said, what if there is a point in the season where Edwin Díaz maybe does become a little bit unreliable? At least now, if you bring in a guy like Pete Fairbanks on a 2-year, $30 million deal, a $15 million AAV, at least now you have that backup role. And like I said, maybe there will be points in the season where maybe Díaz is a little bit overworked. But now, you don't necessarily have to be, necessarily scared to rely on other guys to get those final 3 outs. When you have a guy like Pete Fairbanks, who was done it the last couple of years for the Tampa Bay Rays and is well established of being in that closer role. So I think if the Mets could bring in Pete Fairbanks and he could come in and be that reliable 8th inning guy, and then Edwin Díaz being that 9th inning guy to close out games, I think that is a very good, reliable tandem at the back end of that bullpen. So like I said, if the Mets can bring in Pete Fairbanks, they have to 100% jump all over that. And I think that'll be a fair contract for him. Like I said, trade Kodai Senga, pay down one-third of his contract. And then I would also re-sign Griffin Canning as well. Now, I know maybe some of you guys in the comments weren't big Griffin Canning fans. And I know me and Evan weren't big fans of Griffin Canning as well when the Mets first signed him last in the offseason. But I thought Griffin Canning he was such a good gem and under the radar piece that the Mets added. And it sucked that, that the Mets were not able because this was always my idea for Griffin Canning last year because I know that he had to be implemented into the starter role because guys like Frankie Montas was out at the start of the year due to injury and then you got Shaman as well. But my plan, and Evan also could back me up on this as well because this was also something he was interested in doing. Our plan with Griffin Canning was always okay when those guys start to come back healthy, and maybe we even add on more starting pitching rotation depth because whether that be some of the young guys come up like Nolan McLean, Jonah Tong, Brandon Sproat, you could transition a guy like Griffin Canning to be a long man out of the bullpen. And even guys, when you look at the second half of the year, the Mets severely missed Griffin Canning because, like I said, even when there was points of the second half of the year where the Mets were doing they were doing this piggyback stuff where they were pairing guys like Clay Holmes and Sean Manaea together, or where they were pairing Kodai Senga and maybe even Jonah Tong, it would have been very helpful to have a guy like Griffin Canning there. And listen, I get that Griffin Canning kind of started to decline a little bit back in late June, but he was so effective early on in the year. I always felt that okay, maybe as a starter, he was always kind of going to decline. But I felt that if you moved him into that long man role, you could preserve him a little bit better and you could save him a little bit better for the second half of the year. And like I said, he would be, just that very valuable piece out of that bullpen where just in case if a guy had a very bad outing, similar to what we saw in David Peterson in his start against the Marlins in City Field, where he ended up giving 8 runs over what was like an inning and a third, inning 2/3. If you could have had a guy like Griffin Canning there, that takes a huge load off, some of the guys in your starting rotation, and a guy like Canning could just eat innings. And I listen, I thought Canning was so good last year in terms of, his fastball looked a lot better. His changeup looked a lot better. His slider looked very great as well. He was getting a lot of swing and miss on his stuff as well. So I think if the Mets could bring him back on a 1-year, $5 million deal, and you could have him inserted into your bullpen as a long man, I would 100% be interested in bringing back Griffin Canning to place him in that role. Pause. What did I say? Because I did not catch that, but yeah, I did not catch that. So if you could write that down or maybe text me what I said because I just didn't catch that. But yeah, it is what it is. But guys, now we move on to the position. Take a huge load off. Okay, yeah. So then I'll give you a little late pause there. But guys, now we're gonna move on to the position player moves. What I would do firstly, I would sign Cody Bellinger to a 5-year, $142.5 million deal. I believe the AAV would be around that. Let me just quickly bring that up for you guys. So if the Mets were to sign Cody Bellinger for that deal, I believe that would be a $28 million AAV. And for me, I would put Cody Bellinger, if I were to sign him, I would place him in left field. And then I know we'll get to Brandon Nimmo at that point. And people say, what's going on with Brandon Nimmo? Are you going to trade him? Are you going to move him somewhere else in the field? We'll obviously get to more of that. But if the Mets were to bring in a guy like Cody Bellinger, obviously this is a guy that's or not really defensive first, but he's very defensive reliable. And obviously, like I said, if you guys recall back to the David Stearns press conference at the end of the year, one of the biggest things that Stearns really prioritized and talked about that the Mets wanted to improve on this offseason was improving just the all-around defense, or around just all around the field, whether that be in the outfield or whether that be in the infield as well. So I would sign Cody Bellinger. I would place him in left field. I would then sign Josh Taylor to a 4-year, $90 million deal, play him at first base. And I know you guys are going to say, where's Pete Alonso? Are you not bringing back Pete Alonso? Guys, unfortunately, in my offseason plans, I do not have Pete Alonso coming back. Now, let me explain why. Would I want Pete Alonso to come back? 100%. I love Pete Alonso. He's been a great Met. He's been a great servant. Obviously, he hits home runs. He has the Mets, the Mets franchise record for home runs. I just think for me, and I'm going to say this right now, and listen, I might be wrong on this. I might be right on this. I do not know. But for me, I think there's going to be a deadline on Pete Alonso. Because if you guys recall last year, Pete Alonso signed very late with the Mets. He signed, I believe it was back in mid-February or even early February. I don't believe that the Mets and David Stearns and Steve Cohen, I don't believe they will be willing to wait that long to potentially sign Pete Alonso because they have other holes to fill out. Pause. They have other things to prioritize with the team. whether that be other outfield spots or whether that be other infield spots as well. So, like I said, for me, if Pete Alonso is not signed by the start of January or even mid-January, I don't believe he's back. I don't believe he's back as a Met because I don't believe that Stearns and Cohen are willing to do this back and forth thing with Scott Boras and Pete Alonso, where it's these negotiations here and there, and you say, okay, we have a contract here. Are you willing to match it? I don't believe that the Mets will be willing to play that game. So I believe that early on that the Mets would be willing to move on from Pete Alonso early and not sign to a contract. But listen, is there a world where Pete Alonso does come back? 100%. But I believe if he does come back, it's going to be for a 4-5-year deal around that $28.5 to $30 million mark. I believe if Pete Alonso wants anything more than that, and even then, I could even see Stearns be hesitant to give Pete Alonso that fifth year. I'd be more inclined to, but ideally, if you were to bring back Pete Alonso, it'd be on a 4-year deal. Again, and he even might end up settling for that type of deal. I just don't believe, like I said, the Mets can afford to wait that long for Pete to make a decision on whether, where he wants to sign. Because like I said, the Mets have other priorities that they need to improve upon in this team. So, like I said, if Pete Alonso does sign early, I fully believe he'll be back with the Mets. But if we get to, like I said, beginning of January, beginning of January, mid-January, and Pete Alonso still not signed, I don't believe he's back with the Mets. I just don't see that happening. So, like I said, I'd sign Cody Bellinger. I play him in left field. And like I said, Bellinger is also good to sign because, like I said, he's very versatile. Can play left field, can play center field, can play first base as well, can also DH a little bit as well. So, and I believe, he'd be a very good, valuable bat as well to insert in the middle of this lineup. Like I said, I would then sign Josh Naylor to a 4-year, $90 million deal. Again, like we talked about before, David Stearns wants to improve the defense of this team. Josh Naylor, when you look at on Baseball Savant, his percentile rating in terms of defense very high in the red. So and again, like Josh Naylor is also not a bad bat as well. This is a guy that can hit for power, can get on base, and also work counts, and he's a very good middle of the lineup bat and the middle of the lineup threat. So and this was also some of the things that I don't agree with other Mets fans saying. It's like, because we know the saying that Mets fans have been saying about Pete Alonso. It's like, oh, if you don't bring, you had to bring out Pete Alonso. How are you going to replace all that production at first base? And my option and my argument to that is, okay, sure, Pete Alonso does provide you a lot of, he does provide you a lot of value and does provide you, a lot of, things in terms of stats like home runs and RBIs. But you don't have to replace Pete Alonso just through one position or through one player. You could spread out that money and improve in other spots as well in terms of defensively, and also add more bats as well. And that's why for me, I would be more comfortable, signing guys like Cody Bellinger and Josh Naylor and adding them to the roster in terms of just bringing back a guy like Pete Alonso and then not doing anything else. But at the end of the day, that is just my opinion. Other Mets fans, they'll probably have other opinions. They'll say you have to bring back Pete. Listen, like I said, and I will always repeat this, I would like to have Pete back on this team, but I'm also not going to just shell out any type of contract for him just because, he's a lifelong Met and he has a home run record. Like, I don't believe that's a smart way of operating a baseball team. And I don't believe that David Stearns also has that same feeling as well. So it's like I said, if Pete Alonso does come back, cool. But like I said, I don't believe that, like I said, and the big thing will be, I don't believe that the Mets will be willing to wait. But then other than that, we then move on to the next point. I do think the Mets would be willing to trade, or they will trade for Luis Robert. And in that trade, I have them sending Jeff McNeil and Mark Vientos to the Chicago White Sox. And I know this is a point because I know Brian, who's also he's not in here right now specifically, but he's a big fan of the show and he's always in here commenting. But we kind of had a discussion about this because, he was talking about, some places where he would look to improve the team. And I brought up the point where maybe the Mets would circle back and try to trade for Luis Robert in the offseason. Because if you guys recall, back to the trade deadline, the Mets tried to trade for Luis Robert. They just could not get a deal done with the Chicago White Sox. And he ended up saying, I'm not sure if trading for Luis Robert would be the best option because, what if a guy like Carson Bench is ready to go? You don't necessarily want to block him. And I do agree with him to a certain point on that point, but you also have to be careful with that because, listen, I know all of us in this chat right here, and I know all of us Mets fans are very, we're very excited, and we have a lot of anticipation and a lot of expectation for Carson Bench when he eventually comes up and, takes over the center field spot. I just don't think it's smart to sit here and say, oh, and pencil in Carson Bench as the starting center fielder come opening day, because again, there's not and again, like I said, we all have high anticipation for Carson Bench, but there's also not per se, how do I want to put this? There's not clear evidence to say that Carson Bench is going to come up here from day one and just beat this outstanding major league level talent. Because we even see some other major league level talent, whether that be guys like Jackson Holiday or even on the pitch side with Jonah Tong, they could come up here and struggle. But I believe having that extra depth, and also if you trade for a guy like Luis Robert, I know his offensive stats haven't been great necessarily, but if we are going to fully believe and sit here and buy in to the Jeff Albert and the Troy Snitker hitting approach and hitting philosophy, you could see a guy like Luis Robert, come into this new Mets hitting lab under guys like Jeff Albert and Troy Snitker, and we could see Luis Robert get back to his offensive production of what he was doing, back in 2020, 2021, and even parts of 2022. So that's why for me, I would be, willing to trade for Luis Robert. And listen, I get that, he has $20 million on his contract, so it is a lot of money. But I believe that, if the White Sox are willing to trade a guy like, or the Mets are willing to trade a guy like Jeff McNeil, and the White Sox are willing to take some of his contract and also take Mark Vientos in return as well, you're kind of offsetting the money there a little bit, because like I said, Luis Robert makes $20 million a year, but Jeff McNeil also makes $15 million a year, and the contracts are very similar because Luis Robert Jr. next year has a club option, which Jeff McNeil also has a club option as well. So I could see that type of trade happening. Will it at the end of the day? I am not sure, because I'm not sure what the White Sox think of Jeff McNeil. I'm not sure what they fully think of Mark Vientos, but we will see what happens. But I would love to see it. If Luis Robert Jr. would come here, he would come into center field. You have Cody Bellinger out in left field, and then you have Juan Soto out in right field. I believe the defense there then in the outfield would severely improve, and then we'll also get the Brandon Nimmo as well, and what you end up doing with him as well. But then I also have a second trade, because since the Mets end up moving Jeff McNeil to the Chicago White Sox, they of course need a second baseman to replace him. So I have the Mets trading for Brandon Donovan, where they send Ronnie Mauricio and Ryan Clifford to the Cardinals. And I know a lot of you guys, maybe you're not necessarily familiar with Brandon Donovan, but here's my reason why I think Brandon Donovan would be a very solid addition for the Mets. This is a guy who, not the greatest bat speed, because if you look at his bat speed, only 13th percentile in the blue on Baseball Savant. But this is a guy that squares up the ball, 96th percentile on Baseball Savant. He doesn't chase. He's in the 69th percentile. He doesn't whiff. He doesn't strike out. Draws a decent amount of walks. A guy that hits for average, gets on base, but also if he does need to hit for some power as well, he's also very reliable as well. And also, let's not forget that one of the weaknesses from last year's Mets team were they were a very poor fastball hitting team. Well, when you look at Brendan Donovan's splits in terms of hitting fastball, 293 average, 279 expected batting average, a slugging of 429, expected slugging of 434. And also the fact that he also plays a very solid second base as well, and he's also versatile as well. He could also play the outfield, and I believe he can maybe also play a little bit of third base as well. But also, and I know when you look at the Baseball Savant for his defense, he's only in the 40th percentile in terms of fielding, in terms of range and OAA. But when you look at his 2024 numbers, he's all the way up. He's all the way up in the 87th percentile. So this is a guy in Brendan Donovan, and the Cardinals are going to look to trade some guys. Obviously, you do have a guy like Nolan Arenado who is available, and the Cardinals are probably going to look to dump. So you could look at that as an option to say, oh, you can improve your third base there. But for me, Nolan Arenado, he's making a lot of money, first of all, and he's old, and he's kind of just past his best at this point. So I would not be interested in the Mets trading for Nolan Arenado. But if the Cardinals, like I said, if they're willing to unload guys, and Brendan Donovan, who's soon going to be up for a contract, and I believe he's making $5 million this year, and then he has another year of arbitration left. If the Mets could add a guy like Brendan Donovan, and then you could staple him to that 7th, 8th spot of the order, I believe you improve the depth. You improve the depth of your lineup. You lengthen your lineup even more, and all around, like I said, your defense gets improved and your versatility improves. And like I said, this is a guy, Brendan Donovan, as well, also gets on base, squares up the ball, doesn't strike out a lot, doesn't whiff a lot, and also does draw a decent amount of walks. So if the Mets could look to trade for a guy like Brendan Donovan, I would be 100% in on that as well. I know there was rumors about a guy like Ketel Marte being available, which, listen, if the Mets could trade for Ketel Marte, I will not say no. Obviously, I would rather Ketel Marte over Brendan Donovan, but I think a more realistic move would be that a guy like Brendan Donovan would be available. And if he does become available because the Cardinals are looking to trade guys, which I do anticipate they will, Brendan Donovan should be all over the Mets' radar. And especially if they could only get him for a package of Ronnie Mauricio and Ryan Clifford, 100% they need to jump all over that. And then one more, just this would be a backup role, but Ty France, I would sign him to a 1 year, $1.5 million deal. Not, the greatest bat in the world, but you're signing him for, for his glove. Because I believe even on Baseball Savant, and I'll bring it up. I will bring it up here. Yeah, he was 96th percentile in terms of defense. Last year. So if you could add a guy like Ty France to back up a guy like Josh Naylor at first base, and we all know that Naylor has a decent glove at first base to begin with, I think that is a very good would be a very good backup and a very good bench option for the Mets to improve on. But guys, have another graphic here for you guys, and basically this would be just how I would align the Mets next year. So, like I said, starting from catcher, Francisco Alvarez, Francisco Alvarez at catcher, Josh Naylor at first base, Brendan Donovan at second base, Francisco Lindor at shortstop. You keep Brett Baty at third base. I know maybe some people aren't huge fans of that, but for now, I would keep Brett Baty at least to start at third base for the start of the year. Obviously, if you get towards the trade deadline and another big time, third baseman becomes available, sure, trade for that. So that third baseman, for example, and then maybe you flip Brett Baty another way, or maybe Brett Baty becomes a bench option at that point. So, but for now, I would keep Brett Baty at third base, and hopefully, maybe his bat improves with the addition of Jeff Albert and Troy Snicker coming in. Maybe you see Brett Baty's bat take that next step, and also Brett Baty, even though when he first came up, his glove wasn't the greatest. Over the last couple of years, his glove has taken a massive step forward in terms of his overall defense at third base. And then for my outfield, of course, like I said, Cody Bellinger, Luis Robert, and Juan Soto. I believe your defense in the outfield automatically becomes a lot better just with Cody Bellinger and Luis Robert being there. And obviously Juan Soto, I know his defense is not the greatest, but Juan Soto is being paid, and he's on this team to mash, to hit home runs, and to get on base and to get walks. So I can deal with his defense not being the greatest if Juan Soto is giving you if Juan Soto is giving you the type of production which he was giving you last year. And then people might say, "Oh, what's the plan with Brandon Nimmo?" My plan with Brandon Nimmo, because I don't think you could trade Brandon Nimmo. Listen, and this was something that we discussed on the last podcast. Even though maybe it's the best solution for the Mets to maybe move on from Brandon Nimmo, because like I said, I think they need to move on from a certain part of this core because they have failed and have come up short over the last couple of years. I just don't believe it's realistic to trade Brandon Nimmo because of, one, his contract, and two, his no movement clause. But okay, if Brandon Nimmo is going to stay, for me, I would move him to DH. And my reasoning for this is because, listen, Brandon Nimmo for me could still play a little bit of the outfield. I just don't want him playing outfield for the majority of the time. I believe if you move to DH per se, and I know he's not the stereotypical, DH that you all think of where, he's going to mash, 40, 50 home runs. Brandon Nimmo is going to give you solid offense. He's going to give you anywhere from 25 to 30 home runs. He's going to get on base. He's going to hit for some average. I believe, and like I said, for me, the biggest thing of moving Brandon Nimmo to the DH role is just by getting him out of the outfield. And like I said, you don't have to completely move him out of the outfield. I just want him spending more time at the DH role than I want in the outfield and defensively, because we all know that his defensive metrics and his defensive game kind of dropped off a little bit in the second half of the year. And also the big thing with Brandon Nimmo, because we all know that he's kind of not the most, healthiest player on the Mets. I know he's not completely injury prone, but we do see him, come up with kind of these stiff necks a little bit. And I know he dealt with plantar fasciitis at the end of the 2024 year and 2024 playoffs. So if you do get him off his feet a little bit more and have him DH more, I believe, you'll have a more healthy and a more reliable Brandon Nimmo. But like I said, just because you have Brandon Nimmo DHing does not mean that, you can't have him, play in the outfield a little bit, because this is my plan with this team, right? You make this team a lot more versatile, because obviously, like I said,
this is how I would start the team. But let's say, you can move Cody Bellinger to first base. You then can move Josh Taylor to DH for a day. And then like I said, you can move Brandon Nimmo out to the outfield. Or maybe even, you want to move Cody Bellinger over to center field, have Luis Robert DH. You can move Brandon Nimmo to left field. So there's a lot of versatility and a lot of options that this Mets team could even go with. I mean, even Brandon Donovan, like I said, he could even play a little bit of left field. Is he the greatest left fielder in the world? No, but there is options to go with this team. And then obviously, because like I said, with David Stearns, his biggest priority this year is to majorly improve the defense. When you look at this bench, it's all defense. Tyrone Taylor, not the greatest bat, but good defensively. Luis Acuna, maybe, like I said, maybe his bat improves a little bit with the new hitting coaches, but again, reliable glove, reliable defensively. Ty France, reliable defensively. And then Tomas Nido behind the plate, reliable defensively. So with this team, if this was the team that the Mets would be willing to go with, and this is how they are going to attack this offseason, right away, I mean, listen, like I said, you're going to get some offensive upside as well because Cody Bellinger, very good bat. He's capable of hitting 25, 30 home runs. Josh Naylor, again, capable of hitting 20 to 30 home runs. Maybe if Luis Robert is able to turn the clocks back and maybe under this new hitting lab, maybe you could start to see him, get back to the offensive production that we saw from him back in 2019, 2020, 21, 2022. So there was a lot of offense with this team, but like I said, right away, your defense improved because Cody Bellinger is capable of winning a Gold Glove out in left field and in first base. Luis Robert capable of winning a Gold Glove in center field. Josh Naylor, his defense improves, and then Brendan Donovan, he has a solid glove in second base. And then obviously, like I said, Lindor, reliable defensively. Brett Beatty has improved that defensively, and then Francisco Alvarez has been reliable defensive as well. So right away, when you compare this team, and then also if you look at Kai Correa's also as well, he's a bit of he's also a bit of a defensive guru. So now if you take the better coaching and the better alignment in terms of how you will learn certain guys out in the outfield, the defense of this team severely improves. And again, that is one of the main things that hurt this team last year because their defense was not good. But guys, just to move on to the final graphic that we have here before we wrap things up, this would be my Mets projected 2026 26-man roster. So starters, Tarik Skubal, Nolan McLean, Sean Manaea, Dylan Cease, Clay Holmes. We then move on to the bullpen, Edwin Diaz, Pete Fairbanks, AJ Minter, Brooks Raley, Huáscar Brazoban, Adbert Alzolay, Griffin Canning. And then this last spot could either be like Christian Scott, Brand Sproat, or maybe another depth reliever that the Mets do sign. I'm not sure what other depth relievers they would be willing to bring in, but Christian Scott coming off Tommy John surgery, I believe that maybe he's going to start the year a little bit in the bullpen and start to work up a little bit until he gets back and more comfortable in terms of to a starting role. And then obviously we'll see maybe the Mets do end up adding a couple of other depth relievers in free agency, or maybe they end up trading for a couple guys. We'll obviously see about that. But then we go to the position players. Obviously, Francisco Alvarez, Luis Torrens, they are your two catcher duo. At first base, you have the duo of Josh Naylor and Ty France. At second base, you have Brendan Donovan and Luis Acuna. Lindor is your shortstop. Brett Beatty's at third base. And then your outfield consists of Juan Soto, Luis Robert, Cody Bellinger, Tyrone Taylor, and then Brandon Nimmo being your left fielder / DH option. So let me know what you guys think let me know what you guys think in the comment section about this 26-man role or this 26-man roster. I do like it. I think it's a good team. Whether it's good enough to win the World Series, we shall see. But I do believe this roster, if we see this type of roster, I believe it's a lot more competitive than what we saw from the team last year. But yeah, I mean, guys, before we wrap it up, I'm just gonna go through your guys' comments, just finish this out, and then obviously we'll get out of here. And then yeah, obviously we'll see what happens with the rest of the off season. Two cats again, and Uncle See If We Trust, absolutely. Evan, Diaz, Minter, Raley, Fairbanks. That would be a very decent, good back four to finish out that bullpen, and I would love to watch it if we could see those four guys take the ball pretty much every day, every 2 days, and just see them go out there and come out of that Mets bullpen. It would be electric in my opinion. Frankie Mathos and Tyler McGill, names that curse my ears, 100%. Oh yeah, so we got that. Can he really play center field is the question. Well, I mean, for Luis Robert and Cody Bellinger, we'll obviously have to find out. And obviously, we're going to have to ask Cody about that. Not Cody Bellinger. There's another Cody. He's the center fielder guru. We will have to ask him what his thoughts are on the two center fielders, or at least the two outfielders that I talked about in terms of the Mets adding this year. Two Cats, Bellinger was playing high is still better than Mullins. Bellinger playing high is still better than Mullins here combined, 100%, absolutely. What team do you see Pete most likely going to? There are rumors that the Red Sox could look to hire him, and I know that Tristan Casas really hasn't, flourished so far in Boston so far. And there could be a possibility where the Red Sox end up losing Alex Bregman this year because, again, like Díaz, like Pete Alonso, he ended up opting out of his contract as well. So maybe if the Red Sox end up losing losing a guy like Alex Bregman, maybe they end up pivoting to Pete Alonso. But obviously, like I said, we will see what happens. But to me, I would say that the Red Sox right now would be the most likely landing spot for Pete Alonso. Two Cats again, love Pete, but it's a business at this point, and the team needs to do whatever it takes to win a chip. We've been waiting 40 years, 100%. You cannot let feelings and you cannot let get emotions. You cannot let feelings in and not let emotions get in the way in terms of making smart baseball moves. Pantries love it and would not be upset with any of those moves. Thank you, Pantries. We'll see what happens. Two Cats again. Soto didn't have too many outfield blunders this year, much more with the Yankees. He's there for the bat, though, 100%. 100%. Two Cats again. Nimmo got injured eating breakfast. Nimmo. I would not be surprised if Nimmo would get hurt getting out of bed or walking down the stairs. But yeah. Then Two Cats. Bellinger was solid for the Yankees this year, and that's for sure, 100%. And then Two Cats again. If anybody is to take down the Dodgers, it's going to be an NL team. Since 2020, the Dodgers have only lost to NL teams in the playoffs. They make to the World Series and they have won 2.5 times. Rays, Yankees, Jays. Obviously, you're only giving that a half mark because of the 2020 World Series. Even though for me, I consider that a full World Series, but that's just your opinion and that's my opinion. I guess we can agree to disagree on that point, but. Anyway, guys, that's going to be it for me for this podcast episode. Like I said, I'm going to try to, bring out these podcast episodes every week. It's just like I said, with the news in terms of, because sometimes it's a slow news week, sometimes it's a fast news week. Obviously, if it's a slow news week and there's a lot of moves, I'm probably not going to end up going live. Maybe I'll end up going and dropping a video for you guys, maybe like a top 5 list of how the Mets could look to improve their roster. Maybe I'll give you guys some names and some players that the Mets could look to trade for or maybe sign. But yeah, unless, like I said, if there's a lot of news, obviously we'll be going live. And then, obviously if there is any big time trades, if there's any big time signings, we'll obviously be here. So, we'll be live and, we'll be breaking it down. And hopefully you guys will be here as well in the comment section. And, and then, and obviously we'll be discussing and talking things out. So, but yeah, and obviously, and like I said, also apologies for no podcast episode last week. Like I said, slow news week. There wasn't a lot going. There wasn't a lot of things going on in terms of news. But since the World Series is over now, since free agency has officially started, since the GM meetings have officially started as well, hopefully we start to see some more news start to drop, and hopefully we get some trades and some more trades and some more signings as well. And obviously, like I said, if anything breaks in terms of news, we'll be here to talk about it and discuss it on Mets Central. But yeah, just going to go through you guys' final comments. Thanks, Matt. Great stream. Appreciate that. Two Cats. Hornet again. Great stream, Matt. Thank you. And Pantry says Evan doing all right. Yeah, Evan is doing fine. Hopefully, like I said, not sure when he's going to fully return to doing streaming with me here on Mets Central, but hopefully that's soon. But like I said, hopefully for him, he's taking his time. And he's doing a lot better. But yeah, anyway, guys, that's gonna be it for me. Like I said, hopefully I'll be back next week. If not, maybe expect a video. But if not, I'll update you guys. Obviously, just look out on Twitter. Maybe I'll post a notification to let you guys know anytime I'm planning to go live. And then obviously look out on YouTube as well, because I'll try to kind of put out reminders 24 hours before I go live and do a podcast episode, just so you guys can get prepared and so when you guys can expect a live stream to happen. But anyway, guys, that's gonna be it for me. Peace, guys. Let's go, Mets.